This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
And the simplification then begs the question, if we are looking at things that say the same thing within a bundle, why can't we focus on just the very best measurement in each bundle and greatly reduce the focus on a certificate of analysis?
This week on the show, Joe Hertrich discusses what really matters on a malt COA. Joe's knowledge is vast, with over 50 years of experience in the industry. He's held positions with Stroh, Pabst, Christian Schmidt, and he's a retired group director of brewing raw materials at Anheuser-Busch. He's a consultant, a mentor to the Craft Maltsters Guild, and a lecturer during the Master Brewers Brewing and Malting Science course, among many other things. This episode originally aired as a 4-part series in late 2016. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode that you won't want to miss. You get a COA from your malt supplier, and there's a whole bunch of different parameters on that analysis, some of which seem to say maybe some of the same stuff. Which of these parameters should brewers really be focusing on?
You can get probably over 20 items now on a COA, and it can be daunting to sort through them. But I want to sort of take the position and talk about they're not all necessary. Some of them are redundant, and I think I can offer a simplified way of what to concentrate on. First of all, is maybe simplifying our thoughts. Start with some history. A reminder that we always haven't had the tools that we have today, and we were very successful. I mean, malt was made for thousands of years without today's scientific measurements or laboratories, and it was all based on a couple of simple process observations. For example, one of the things that's always been understood about malting is that malting's successful if the acrospires get to exceed 3/4 of the length of the kernel. Also, malting is successful if when you part the kernel, a green malt kernel, toward the end of malting, if it completely smears freely without any hard particles in it. And then it's successful malting if you can keep a very nice, fresh, peeled cucumber aroma all through it, and there's no evidence of musty or moldy things. So, again, there was no laboratories involved in this and no scientific method. And this was true also for finished malt. What I just described was sort of monitoring the malting process, but the finished malt was simply evaluated by a chew, sort of the human version of a friability meter, that if there was no residual hard particles and it had a good flavor and aroma, malting was successful. Now, even after we had some scientific method, as recently as 1934, I read an interesting article. Now, think about this. This is right after Prohibition. It's before the founding and creation of the American Society of Brewing Chemists. And the U.S. Brewers Academy, Association, the U.S. Brewers Association tried to make a definition of how malt analysis should be presented and what represented quality malt. And it's very interesting. At that time, outside of a few physical measurements like moisture or assortment or variety, they only suggested 3 chemical analysis or wet chemistry analysis to define malt: extract, the coarse fine difference, and the color of the malt.
Life was simpler back then, huh?
It sure was. It sure was. And this is way before there was any discussion of measuring protein or enzymes or things like that. And I think what is true all throughout history is that extract has been a proxy for modification. If you look at very, very old analysis like the Hartung Index series or the British cold water extracts, they're indicators of what kind of extracts available in the malt without mashing it, without activating enzyme systems, that type of thing. And it's just looking at this as extract and coarse fine difference. They're saying what people have known for a long time: good extract is a proxy for modification. They went on to, besides describing those 3 analyses, then they went on to say, here's how you should grade malt in standard grade, choice grade, or fancy grade. And again, the focus was on modification and growth, because the grading scores to get from standard to fancy, the extract increased, the coarse fine difference was reduced, the growth counts over 3/4 of a length increased, but the color stayed the same all through that period. So I thought that was very interesting. And even then, moving up to, I was looking at some analysis from 1965, 30 years later, we still, after the physical measurements, we were still satisfied to describe malt with 7 numbers: the extract, coarse fine difference, color. But we started measuring protein, total and soluble, and we started measuring enzymes and reporting them at that time: diastatic power and alpha amylase, but still nowhere near the complexity that we're at today. So I think the way to simplify malt analysis is to look at what is the indicators that show that the transition from barley to malt has been completed, and to really demonstrate that that's the most important function going on, that if you can make the transition from barley to malt, there's a number of things that are just outcomes that don't need to be reported and cluttered up the analysis, because they are there with certainty. If we take off our brewer's hat for a minute and we consider what the barley kernel is trying to accomplish and what its goal is, in nature, if you planted a seed in the soil, a barley seed or any other seed, in the spring it would activate with warmth and moisture. It would create a set of enzymes. And then in the plant world, it would completely digest the kernel to create a barley plant, just getting roots down and getting a leaf up above the soil. And the work of the kernel is done as soon as there's a green plant above the soil and it starts to work photosynthetically. If we think about this from then, what do we want to do from brewers and as maltsters and brewers standpoint? We want to do the same activation of the kernel with warmth and moisture. We want to create all those enzymes, but we're not going to grow barley plants. We want to just partly digest kernel structures. And then in malting, where we really deviate from nature, then we go ahead and finish it with kilning to develop flavor and color. Now look at where the alignment is here between nature and malting and brewing interests. And that alignment is, we absolutely want to create enzymes, and we want to do a controlled digestion of structures. And that's today's focus. I'm going to put kilning and flavor and color off as a topic for another podcast, but I want to focus on this creation of enzymes and the partial digestion of structures as a way to really simplify what is important on a certificate of analysis. Now, I think we can look at analysis and we can say to ourselves that there are some redundant analysis present. We have a habit of developing new techniques and improved techniques, but not throwing out the old measurement techniques. And I'll give you some examples as we go along. But I think just about everything on a certificate of analysis can be categorized and grouped into 4 bundles. There'd be bundle 1 would be a measure of protein modification, and there's a lot of measurements in there. Bundle 2 would be the measure of carbohydrate modification. Bundle 3 is the measurement of enzyme potential, and I think that sounds like it's in reverse, but I can tell you that if protein modification and carbohydrate modification take place, the inference is there that the enzymes were there and present. The reason enzymes have to be looked at as a separate bundle is they're influenced by kilning. So when you look at enzymes on a malt analysis, you're not really looking at were they originally created. You're looking at were they preserved through the kilning process. And then the bundle 4 are measures of color and flavor. And just think about this. I just mentioned we started with 20 items. I believe every one of those virtually can be put into one of these 4 categories. And the simplification then begs the question, if we are looking at things that say the same thing within a bundle, why can't we focus on just the very best measurement in each bundle and greatly reduce the focus on a certificate of analysis?
That makes sense to me.
Yeah, well, I think we can do it. So let's start and talk about protein modification for a minute, and let's start with what is actually happening in the kernel, and what do you want to really measure? You want to measure, has there been adequate digestion of insoluble barley protein into usable soluble protein forms for brewing? We know that there's the insoluble barley protein is not usable in terms of amino groups, in terms of creating foam, in terms of creating body. It's not as usable as the modified forms that come after malting. So we want to make sure that we create nutrients for yeast. We want to make sure we create the mid-sized proteins for flavor and for foam. And we also have to manage the bigger proteins that are going to get involved in hazes and sediments. But it's very important, we have to have indications, has there been adequate digestion? There's another very important part of protein modification that sometimes is missed, and it has to do with its link to carbohydrate modification. We have to make sure that there's enough protein modification that we get to the endosperm cell wall where the beta-glucan and arabinoxylan is, because we think of the cell wall structures as being primarily beta-glucan and arabinoxylan, but it also is about 10% protein. And there has to be digestion of the protein content of the cell wall to enable beta-glucanase into that part of the structure to digest beta-glucan. And one of the shortcomings that often happens when beta-glucan is not reduced, it's because protein modification wasn't advanced far enough to allow endosperm cell wall reduction to let the beta-glucanase in. And I put this in simpler terms as good protein modification is actually the low beta-glucan enabler. We have to get broken up in that cell wall, the protein portion of it. So
that's interesting, Joe, because I was going to ask if you maybe were going to consider a 4th bucket of cytolytic modification, but it sounds like I was originally thinking that maybe you were going to say that was inferred if you have the carbohydrate modification, but it sounds like really you can also infer that from some of the protein modification as well.
It's 2 steps. If you had that, the bundle would not be standalone, John. It crosses over, though. In other words, carbohydrate modification is going to be the freeing of the extract by the action of beta-glucanase and other enzymes attacking pentazans. But this part of it I'm saying is, if you don't have well-modified malt proteolytically, the beta-glucanase, even though it's created, is never going to get a chance to work in the cell wall. So the 2 overlap, and it's I guess I would state it as good cytolytic reduction is the artifact of the combined proteolytic and carbohydrate reduction.
That makes good sense to me.
So what kind of measurements do we have then in the protein areas where we might have some overlap as we get into the certificate analysis? We know that protein is measured, total protein and soluble protein are measured, but they're not really important standalone. What they're really important for is to create the S over T ratio, the Kolbach index, which is the percentage of the total barley protein that has been reduced and has become soluble protein. So it's the simple mathematics of soluble protein over total protein equals ratio. We also have a measurement of free amino nitrogen. This came along as making sure that there's enough of the simple amino groups available for use nutrition. Now, this test really doesn't measure just amino acids. It measures ammonia, N-group nitrogen that's on more complex peptides. But it's an indicator is, has there been enough reduction to allow plenty of simple amines for yeast? Also, we can measure in the protein modification area pH. One of the things that happens in malting is as the reduction and digestion of the kernel takes place, the pH reduces, drops down, and the well-modified malts tend to be down in the 5.8 and 5.9 ranges. Malts that aren't well-modified will be above 6. We also think of, because protein modification does mean creation of enzymes, we also think of alpha amylase as a protein modification issue. And it's here, and I emphasize alpha amylase is here, but diastatic power is not, because alpha amylase is relatively insensitive to kilning and survives kilning quite well. You can't put diastatic power here because it is heavily affected by kilning, and I'll speak to that a little bit later when we talk about enzymes. But here we have a whole bunch of measurements. You can make total protein, soluble protein, the S over T ratio, free amino nitrogen, pH, and alpha amylase. And I would say in this protein modification bundle, the most important and the most significant one is S over T ratio, the Kolbach index, because that's the measure of progress of the protein modification function of the kernel. So I would just sort of put a pin in that, in protein, and sort of stick it on the side here, that we want to remember that Kolbach index is really, really important. Now, if we skip over to carbohydrate modification and call that bundle 2, what's really important here and what we're trying to understand is, has there been adequate digestion of the dense barley endosperm structure, the cell walls, the long chain starches, so that this malt can be easily milled, easily extracted, and that the extract is free flowing for enzymes in the mashing process. And we really need to, what we're really trying to understand is there recoverable extract, and can we get consistent attenuation? Because a lot of people that look at inconsistent attenuation think of it as an enzyme problem, but in some cases it's not. In some cases it's erratic attenuation has to do with the quality of the extract that the enzymes are working on. So to me, it's very important that it's comprehensively modified and free-flowing so that the enzymes will get a consistent attenuation result. So we have extract measurements that we can get. We also have the fine coarse different measurement. A measure of carbohydrate modification is viscosity, because it's a measure of how free-flowing the extract is. There's the measure of beta glucan that is given to us now on malt analysis, and also, and I'll talk about this separately. I put it under carbohydrate modification, but friability, if in the case of a friability meter being used. So in this particular case, if we step back a minute, we want protein modification to be complete. And it has to be completed in the malt house because we can't do very much in the brewery with poor protein modification. And we want all the enzymes formed, and we want the proteins totally digested. But in carbohydrate modification, we had to be very careful. We want it to be reduced and free-flowing, but we don't want to start consuming the extract as going a step too far in building this new barley plant. Now, the importance of these to the brewer, the importance of protein modification and carbohydrate modification, the brewing impacts of these are relatively the same. They involve reduced extract recovery because the extract hasn't been reduced. They involve slower runoffs and more turbid worts. And again, erratic attenuation achievement. And I want to emphasize this because it's erratic attenuation achievement, not because of erratic enzymes, but because in varying levels of modified malts, you'll get varying levels of condition of the extract exposed to the enzymes. In the extreme, we can get to beer filterability and physical stability problems. And it really is important for malt functionality to have strong protein modification, strong carbohydrate modification. Now, I should insert that there are risks to over-modification. If you over-modify protein-wise, you over-modify carbohydrate-wise, you tend to work toward thinner beer body and flavor, and you can have no negative impacts on foam. But I would explain this in terms that a brewer would understand. I always explain this as the risks of under-modification and over-modification are not symmetrical. It's similar to when you're pitching yeast cells into wort to begin fermentation in the sense of risk. You'd like to pitch exactly the right amount of yeast. However, the risks of underpitching and having a low cell count at the beginning of fermentation are much greater, and there are much more negative outcomes than the risk of overpitching and having too high a cell count at the start of fermentation. The analogy it carries through here. There are many, many more risks of under-modification on protein and under-modification on carbohydrates than there is to over-modification. Now, there was one other bundle that I would talk about here, and that's bundle number 3, which is the carbohydrate enzymes. Now, notice that in malt, we don't measure protein enzymes. We measure carbohydrate enzymes because, again, conceptually in malting, all the protein work should be done before the malt leaves the malt house. And the carbohydrate enzyme should be there for brewers to utilize in the mashing process. So in the terms of carbohydrate enzymes, we're not really concerned was there enough developed, because if we have good modification, we know they were developed. But really what we want to measure the carbohydrate enzymes for is, were they preserved during kilning? Because that can be an issue. If you would look at any standard 2-row, the DP of it on the last day of germination before it went to kiln, that level of DP could be 210 to 240 units. Put it through a normal brewer's kilning process, and you go ahead and you have a finished malt with 140 or 150 DP. It's standard, and it's a known phenomenon that a third of the DP is going to be damaged on the kiln. So usually whenever you don't have enough DP in malt for whatever reason, it's not because it wasn't created in the malt house, it's because it wasn't preserved during kilning. But we're going to talk in a minute. We have more than enough DP present for all malt brewers to use. So if we took these bundles, bundle number 1, and we put a pin in, S over T was the most important measure. And if we take carbohydrate as modification as number 2, we should put a pin in beta-glucan as the single best indicator of carbohydrate modification. And then number 3, because we got to make sure DP survived on the kiln, we're interested only in DP coming out of that bundle. Now, again, if we added color and then we would have 4 attribute bundles, but we're going to put color and flavor off for another podcast. So if you took the traditional COA for malt and you looked at this, you could actually pull out the 4 most important numbers. And actually, I might even drop enzymes for being the most important for all malt brewers because they're in excess of what they need. Enzymes become a much more material issue for adjunct brewers, where they're going to dilute the malt attributes with some adjunct. But the most important attributes to really focus on are our S over T ratio and beta-glucan. It really, these other analysis are subsets of those two, or they're measurements that measure the same thing that are very good, that are good, but they're obsolete now. Probably in the extract area is the best. The best way to explain how analysis becomes obsolete, John. First of all, we had fine coarse difference years ago. That's an excellent, easy to understand analysis. You grind the malt very finely and see how much extract there is. A grind that's so fine you could not execute it in the brewery. Then you grind the malt very coarse grind, similar to what we used in the brewery. Get the extract from each of those and subtract them. And a measure of how well modified the malt is how big or small the difference is between those two. The goal would be to asymptotically approach the fine grind malt extract with the coarse grind, because it would mean no matter how you ground the malt, you were going to get a good extract from it. And typically, well-modified malts today have a difference of 1.0 between the two extract numbers. You have to be careful if fine grind differences are higher than, say, 1.7 up toward 2.0. But here's the problem with that analysis today. We're talking about as we get very well-modified malts, we get very, very small differences between very, very large numbers. And you might be trying to look at the difference between a 71 or an 81.5 extract on a coarse and an 82.5 extract on a fine grind to get a fine coarse difference of 1. The problem is that difference is exceeded by the in-lab variation in the extract analysis. And if you talk to maltsters, they say, well, quite frequently we run that analysis and we get a negative number.
Right. So you're saying that's the reason for that is because extracts have increased over time? Is that what
and we have partly because they've increased over time, and partly as we've learned more, we've had a higher expectation for a lower coarse fine.
Okay, that makes sense.
But now we're talking about a very, very small difference between very, very large numbers. There's another practical problem for malt labs, and that is they have to bash twice as many samples.
Yeah.
Just to get that difference number.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And in fact, in some labs, they actually now have proven the relationship between viscosity and beta-glucan, and they can estimate the coarse fine if you require. But it's just a number. It's a methodology that has been passed by, and first of all, it was passed by viscosity, and viscosity is a good concept also. I mean, it's the engineering definition of viscosity is resistant to flow. Now, who wouldn't be in favor of low resistance to flow, right? In the brewery. So, but again, you're dealing with viscosity numbers that on a well-modified malt might say be 1.44, and on a not well-modified malt might be 1.52. there's not very many significant numbers out there in the hundredths digit that differentiate from a well-modified to a poorly modified. And all of these have kind of really been passed by beta-glucan.
That's interesting. I'm glad to know. I've always sensed that maltsters, really didn't like the coarse fine difference. So it's interesting to know the history on that. Now you bring up beta-glucan again. You stuck a pin in that earlier. But I've noticed. I agree with you. It's a very important parameter here. But a lot of maltsters don't even put that on the COA. Why would that be?
Well, it has a wide variation between labs, and maltsters don't like to work with numbers that have wide laboratory variations, because they're invariably going to get involved in discussions with brewers over the meaning of those numbers and the lab variation. But beta-glucan is really, really important, and it's important from a couple perspectives. From a malting process perspective, beta-glucanases are formed very late in the malting process and in germination, and this goes back to the thinking of the barley kernel. The barley kernel is saying, I need to get all the proteolytic enzymes up and running, and because a proteolytic enzyme is actually producing enzymes. I mean, an enzyme is a protein in chemical structure. So that whole proteolytic system has to be up and running. And it's a secondary thing to start digesting the endosperm to turn it into a barley plant. So after the proteolytic enzymes are up and running and the carbohydrate enzymes are up and running, beta-glucanases come very late in germination. And also because the protein modification has to simplify the cell wall structures first to allow access in, we know it's a later process during germination. And beta-glucan reduction then in this sequence is the last major modification event in germination. So I like it as a brewer who supervises and monitors malting. From a malting process perspective, low beta-glucans indicate that you have a product that came out of a patient and completed malting process.
Coming up,
there's no one S over T that is correct for every single variety. If you picked a number, 44 S over T, I can give you varieties that are over-modified at 44, and I can give you varieties that are under-modified at 44.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Whitcomb Selinsky McAuliffe PC serves all brewers in registering and protecting trademarks, navigating the label approval process, and assisting with OSHA inspections and safety compliance. Please go to wsmlawpc.com for more information.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. Don't miss the Maintaining a Clean Brewery webinar March 28th. Several districts meet the last weekend in March. District Texas and San Antonio, District Mid-Atlantic at Basic City Brewing in Waynesboro, and District Midwest at Rheingeist in Cincinnati. District Pittsburgh meets April 15th. The Brewery Packaging and Technology course starts in Madison April 21st. District St. Louis meets April 25th at Second Shift Brewery. The 58th Annual District Caribbean Convention joins forces with District Southeast in Miami May 2nd through the 5th. This is going to be a big meeting with lots of great speakers, including folks who've been on this podcast: Joe Hertrich, Andrew Fradiani, John Mallett, Roy Johnson, Dr. John Paul May, Andy Tavikram, and more. District Philly also meets May 3rd at 2SP Brewing. If you're barrel aging, don't miss the May 9th webinar screening for Lactobacillus acetotolerans in a brewery setting. District St. Paul, Minneapolis meets May 16th at the Star Keller in New Ulm. District St. Louis is at Old Bakery Brewery May 16th. And District Northern Illinois meets at Half Acre Beer May 31st. It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show.
You can't rush the malting process and come up with a low beta-glucan.
That makes sense. Now, yeah. I'm surprised, though, that you're not a little surprised that you don't prefer viscosity over beta-glucan, because isn't that going to catch problems from beta-glucan as well as problems from other areas like pentazans and things like that?
They are very, very closely related. Okay, there's probably of any carbohydrate analysis, modification analysis that line up, viscosity and beta-glucan line up with a very, very repeatable relationship.
Right.
My preference for beta-glucan is on the scale of significant numbers. Again, in viscosity, you might only have 6 or 8 significant numbers out in the hundreds digit. Between 1.44 and 152. In beta-glucan, you have a range of significant numbers from 80 to 220. So the scale, you have a much broader scale. It's true that the in-lab variation of the analysis is wide, but still there's a lot more significant numbers to work with over the range. There's another reason that I like beta-glucan as well as S/T ratio. Since the maltster's job is to manage growth, that happens to be the two numbers that they use to manage the malting process. Now, there's no inline. All you can do when malt is germinating is you can look at the growth counts and you can look at the length of the acrospire and you can feel the moisture, but there's no real-time analysis as we think of malt analysis on finished malt that's going on. And what a maltster does is at the end of the process, when he does the malt analysis, he has all those numbers, but he only looks at S/T and beta-glucan to manage the process in the rearview mirror by going back and making steeping changes and germination temperature and watering changes. Those are the key numbers that the maltsters manage the process with. Okay. So it's really interesting that they'll say, I don't think beta-glucan means very much to the brewer, and we don't want you to make a spec for it, but it's what they use to run their process.
Yeah.
So it's really important, and I was saying it from the process perspective, but from a brewing process perspective, it's really interesting to look at it now as the glue that holds the extract together. Beta-glucan will significantly interfere with runoff and wort turbidity at levels above 200, 225. My own personal experience with beta-glucan interfering with things in the malt house was back in the 80s, in the beginning of beta-glucan measures, and we had some clogus at 220, and it just tied our brew house in knots as we were learning what levels worked and not worked. Now, that's not a level that you see anymore. Everybody is past that point of getting a beta-glucan that is lower than what interferes with the with runoff and wort turbidity. However, it's really important now to look at lower beta-glucan levels as the glue that holds extract together, and it prevents the easy release in mashing. So a lower beta-glucan really assures free-flowing extract for repeatable attenuation and high recovery rates in the brew house. And you see a lot of two-row malts now that are delivered at 80 to 100, for certainly under 120 beta-glucan. And it's the pathway to really good extract recovery. And if we were able to measure, if we didn't have the differences in that extract analysis, if we were still looking at coarse fine, when we see that beta-glucan down at 100, we would see coarse fines. If we could accurately measure them at 0.8 or 0.5, we'd see that coarse grind extract asymptotically approaching the fine grind extract, and we've reached success. I did a lot of work on this at one time because I was concerned that where is the inflection point that you modify so far that you can start to consume extract? In other words, can you, as you're trying to get the fine grind and the extracts up and up and up by a modification, at some point, do you bend over and start to lose extract because you're consuming it as products of modification? And I can tell you on the varieties I was working on, I never reached that point. I was getting the coarse almost identical to the fine, but I hadn't started to lose extract.
Wow.
But that leads us to one other point. With maltsters, maltsters do look at well-modified malt as a risk to them for malting loss, because what we get as very functional malt in rail cars, to them is a possibility that they're starting to see poor yields and malting losses as they're making a more functional malt for us. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a conflict and a back and forth there.
That makes sense.
But what we need to focus on for us is functionality of the malt.
Yeah, of course. Hey, I have just one other question for you about beta-glucan. I know one of the biggest problems is that you can form these gels if you've got too much of it, and I know that's also largely dependent on the amount of shear force. So I'm wondering if you've noticed, the limits you threw out for beta-glucan. Do you think that is a good number no matter what your brew house looks like in a craft brewery, or do you think there are some brew houses that can tolerate different levels of beta-glucan based on not having a lot of shear force from a lot of stirring or pumping and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's more maybe it's not the shear force in mashing so much as the depth of grain beds. The time that I had trouble with 220 in malt, I was operating with like a 25-inch grain bed in the lautering that I was doing at that time. Later on, I worked with breweries that had invested more in lautering that had 10-inch grain beds, and those kind of numbers didn't affect it. I don't know, John. I would say that typically you're probably fine with two-row malts in the 140. You might not get the extract release, but I doubt in any mashing and lautering system that'll interfere with performance on runoff. But I think this is a place where a brewer should reach a relationship of malt to his specific equipment and his specific brewing system. This is a case where a brewer should say, okay, I'm going to document every batch of malt that I use. I'm going to document the beta-glucan level, specifically just that one number, against my brewhouse performance. Whatever is most important to him in brewhouse performance, whether it be runoff time, whether it be number of cuts, whether it be deep cuts, mashups, whatever he uses as a good standard of brewhouse performance, he should take and keep a running record of, when I have this beta-glucan, I have the performance that I like. If I go above X number on beta-glucan, my performance starts to deteriorate. And that would be true of extract yields, and it would also be true of runoff performance. However, however an individual brewer estimates his runoff performance, whether it be speed or whether it be number of cuts. And so I guess the rest of the answer to your question, I think everything is fine in the 140 range. Different systems might start to respond poorly to 160, 180, 200. At different level, at different degrees.
That's great. Thanks for answering that, Joe. By the way, for all those of you listening who heard Joe mention a lauter bed depth of 10 inches, for those of you in the craft beer world, that may seem pretty small, but if you've ever seen a very large lauter tun at one of the major brewers, it's true. A lot of those bed depths are only 10, 12 inches, and they get some pretty screaming fast lauter processes with that too. So.
And there's a reason for that from the breweries that do it that way. They have a very strong feelings about the impact of hot time on and over extraction on beer flavor and beer stability. And the brewery that I'm talking about that has 8 and 10 and 12 inch grain beds, they want to minimize the process time while the grain, the mash, the grains, the wort is hot.
That's right.
Because they want the cleanest, fastest, what they believe is the pathway to a very fresh, crisp beer taste.
Cool.
There's another thing I want to mention for the benefit of craft brewers is I'm going to mention friabilimeters, because if you have a wet chemistry lab and you can get S over T ratios or Kolbachs and you can get beta glucan, you don't necessarily have to have a friabilimeter. But a friabilimeter is a real useful tool if you don't have a wet chemistry lab, or if you want to have your maltster report friabilimeter. And sometimes you can get a friability result easier than you can get a maltster to report a beta glucan result. Now, friabilimeters they're valuable because think of it as a functional analysis of the whole malt system instead of an individual analysis for protein modification and an individual analysis for carbohydrate modification. This is sort of the comprehensive measure of modification. Does the whole malt work as a system? So they're relatively simple devices, and I think it's more likely that maybe a craft brewer would have a friabilimeter instead of a wet chemistry lab. The other thing that craft brewers should prepare for probably is most craft maltsters will not have a full wet chemistry lab and will not be reporting Kolbach ratios and beta glucan. But it's relatively simpler for them to not have a full chemistry lab and have a friabilimeter to evaluate their results. But they're very useful, and
they're pretty inexpensive too, aren't they? Like around $3 or $4 grand or something?
No, I think they're maybe closer to $8.
Oh, okay.
I think it's closer to $8 maybe for the puffer, the industry standard. There may be other manufacturers of them, but the ones that I'm familiar with, they're in that area of at $8,000. But the place, again, the place where they're not, the place where they're most useful is to think about two things. You can get a comprehensive view of modification without a wet chemistry profile. And it's a consolidated modification. It tells you about the malt, protein, and carbohydrate as a system instead of looking at individual components. So I have to point out one other thing that's very important, and that is that modification profiles, when you talk about things like S over T ratio and beta glucan, they are very variety dependent. In other words, there's this concept of protein modification must penetrate and free the extract cell wall material to allow the glucanases to get at the beta glucan. That varies by variety, and it's a hard thing to understand for some brewers that look at maybe an expectation of one S over T is the correct S over T. You can't apply that. There's not one S over T that's exactly right for every variety. And it probably explains a lot about the way people feel about different varieties. in Europe, the breeding programs in Germany, in the UK, they still have as a goal, they do not want any variety that requires higher than about a 40 S over T to allow penetration and to reduce the beta-glucan. Now, in the United States, our varieties have evolved quite a bit. When up until the early 70s, we didn't have any two-row breeding in the United States. We only had varieties that were brought here and adapted and grew, and they were European two-rows. And when I started in brewing, the predominant two-rows were Hanschen and Pirelin and Betze. They were all European varieties that were brought here. Cloggis was the first North American breeding effort, followed by Harrington. Now, those varieties that came from Europe look just like varieties in Europe look today. You could get a very good modification on a 38 to 40 S over T. You had much lower enzymes. The DP on those malts was 95 and maybe a 25 alpha, very, very different, and they took 5 days or 6 days to malt. But the two rows that we have in the United States are very different. And if for instance, the standard that we had for many years, Harrington, could be modified at relatively low beta glucan in the S over T range at 42 to 44. So that was acceptable. And most of the craft brewers that started in the 80s and 90s, that was their standard. However, today, a predominant two-row AC Metcalf, it has to be modified to 46 or 48 S over T to get at the beta-glucan to reduce it. And if you don't take the protein modification to that level, the beta-glucan is not going to come down. And I think a couple other varieties, it explains probably why a lot of craft brewers like Copeland more than they like Metcalf. Copeland still has a relatively modest profile like Harrington, and you can get a good modification and a low beta-glucan in that 42 to 44 range. So people tend to look at Copeland as a little bit quieter variety than Metcalf. And the reason that people don't like the higher modification varieties is that they will produce higher fan, higher soluble protein. There'll be more artifacts to give you a higher color on the kiln. But the point that I want to make sure I get across is there's no one S over T that is correct for every single variety. If you picked a number, 44 S over T, I can give you varieties that are over-modified at 44, and I can give you varieties that are under-modified at 44. A recent experience I think brewers have had in this area is why brewers pretty much rejected the new variety Meredith recently. Are you familiar with Meredith, John? It was a relatively new variety in Canada, and the reason that, and now I just received my recommended varieties for 2017 in Canada, and Meredith has been dropped from the list.
Dropped off, huh? Yeah.
Yeah, it's dropped off now. Now, the reason for that, it required another stretch in S over T. It had to be protein modified to at least 50 to break through to get to the beta-glucan reduction, and it was just people thought that it just created too much protein modification artifact, too much soluble protein, too much fan, and they were rejecting it on that basis. Again, the point I want to leave with everybody is there's no one single number, and if you look at that's correct, and if you look at the simple math of protein and soluble total and ratio, you realize that you can't come up with three independent numbers. They are mathematically linked. And if you take the concept that total protein is delivered to us by nature, and it's going to be the average in the crop that's delivered by rainfall and climate each year, and we can't modify that when we get it to the malt house. And if you take then the concept that the ratio is an indication of modification, and you must observe good modification to get good functional malt, well, then the fallout from that is soluble protein. And if you have a variety that requires a higher S over T to completely make it functional, and you're in a high protein year for total protein, you're going to have some high soluble proteins in your malt. But my point is you have to accept that, because the alternative is to instruct the maltster to reduce the modification to give you a lower soluble protein, and you're going to have a range of negative outcomes from less functional malt. So it's important.
Joe, does that, on a very high level, why SOT S over T is, changes is different for different varieties. Would it be a factor going back to just the breakdown of the different types of protein that are inherent with a different variety? Is that a factor here?
Yeah, I don't know. I know it seems to be a genetic trait, and that. And I don't know about the spectrum of proteins that become soluble, John. I do know that that's probably that's the biggest unexplored area. We're satisfied of dividing it up into insoluble and soluble, but the division of soluble, of how you control the amount of small amino groups and foaming proteins and flavor proteins. Remember that it's an enzyme function. As you keep pushing out, as you keep pushing out to get the S over T higher and bring insoluble over to soluble, the enzymes at the same time are chopping up within the soluble, and it's reducing it to the lowest common denominator.
Right.
And left to go to its extreme, you'd end up with all amine groups, and that's why people that object to high S over T's, they object to it on the basis that you're destroying foaming proteins and you're creating too much FAN. Right. That's going to be a hindrance in the process. But it's a balance, and to me, you have to find functional balance. You have to find how to get functional malt. My argument with people usually is you look at the soluble protein, you look at the modification requirement. If you don't like the outcome, don't try to change the degree of modification. Pick another variety. And I think that's what people do when they say, I don't really want Metcalf, I'd rather have Copeland. Or when they say, I'm going to reject Marathon, I'm not going to buy it at all, and it drops off the approved list. I think that's what they're really saying. So we talked about the importance of low beta glucan. I feel strongly about that. Now if we go back to pinning down that, focusing on what's really important, because of what the comments I just made about the variety dependence of some analysis, the most important factors that somebody should look at is, first, variety. They should know what variety is in the malt, either the pure variety or the varietal blend, because the evaluation of then what is a good S over T and what is the right beta glucan that can be expected, those depend on what the variety is. So I would say that a brewer shouldn't really purchase malt without knowing the variety. But the variety, the S over T ratio, the beta glucan, and if we add to that the friability to make sure there's a good comprehensive number, those are the numbers that really define the functionality of the malt. And you don't really need to know the total protein unless you have some expectations that you want a lower total protein so you can control the amount of modification artifacts. In other words, the idea is if you start out that the modification is really critical, sometimes you're going to have higher proteins coming from nature. The varieties are going to be different in their modification factors. If you really want to control what's happening with soluble protein or with FAN, the way you do that is you either put a cap on the protein you'll accept in your malt, And I know craft brewers that do that. They make their long-term agreements with maltsters that say, I will not take any malt that's above 11.5. And they have to acquire barley and lot it for. So you can control the outcomes at the far end if you don't allow higher protein into the process, total protein into the process, because then there's less to conversion, or pick a variety that's quieter and doesn't convert out. So, you could, the best profile for that in today's varieties is for a craft brewer that really feels strongly about soluble protein or about too much fan. He probably should be thinking more toward Copeland and asking for lower protein Copeland. That's his best. He can get good modification, and he would get less of the protein artifacts at the end. But I think if you were picking up a COA and looking at it really closely, you should be really just focused on what variety you're getting, the S/T ratio, the beta-glucan, and the friability of it. Because a lot of other things are artifacts of the growth. And if you try to change the artifacts of growth, the only choice the maltster has then is to change the growth profile. And that's not good. I think also you should look at, not because they indicate quality malt, but because they're numbers that you need in the brewing process for some evaluation. You should always look at the extract, because you're going to need that to evaluate your yields. You need to have an extract number. You should look at the diastatic power just to be sure that you're above the threshold that is necessary for good attenuation. But again, there is so much adequate DP in malt, you really are not going to see numbers. Let me give you an example. When I think about what's the number that's necessary to carry the brewing process, I always look back to Germany and to the heart of all malt brewing, and all malt brewing with 2 rows. And in Kunze's book, in his 4th edition, he describes some requirements for malt and the average of malt shipments in Europe and in Germany. And in this particular case, you probably see in the United States DPs that are around 140 units on 2 row. Well, in Kunze's book, after you convert the Windisch Kolbach to US ASBC system, the average malt shipments in Europe are 75 DP. That's all that it takes to manage an all malt process. High DPs are a function or a problem for adjunct brewers, but we're not seeing any. There's such an abundance of DP. We don't really even have to see it on lab reports, other than the fact if we're using a higher kilned base malt where you might have a reduced DP, you should have it on there to just be sure of that. It's not necessary for us to look at or worry about fan. Again, using the same strategy, looking back to Europe, what do they do in fan in Europe? Well, in Europe, the average malt shipment on fan is 140 units, 140 ppm fan. The average malt shipment that's going to go into 2 row brewing. Well, in the United States, we ship fans that are 240, 220 all the time, and very rarely under 200. So, if you're having an attenuation problem in an all malt process with a fan that's that high or a DP that's that high, it's really, you need to look elsewhere than your malt for a DP or fan problem.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. In my career, I've never once been burned by fan, and I've only been burned by enzymes one time, and that was a very unusual case where I received a load of wheat malt that had alpha amylase down around 10, which was problematic. But other than that one case, I've never run into receiving malt, that didn't have enough enzymes or that had a problem with fan.
Well, we'll talk about it as a separate issue, John. The place to really watch for that is craft brewers have much more flexibility in what kind of base malt they use. Now, the adjunct brewers, they use this standard pale base malt with the high enzymes in them. But craft brewers, because that number can be as low as 75, they can use much more widely varying base malts. They can use more highly kilned base malts they won't be shipped at 140, they'll be shipped at 90. So that's just something to think about when we talk about color and flavor. The other thing that I don't think that craft maltsters should worry about at all is on malt analysis is to look at alpha amylase. It's a function. It's a problem for adjunct brewers. But again, looking back to the standards for two-row malt in Germany, where there's all malt brewing, they don't even talk about alpha amylase. There's such an abundance in the balance of enzymes within DP. There's such an abundance of alpha amylase. There's really no reason to report it. A typical German malt report does not have alpha amylase on it. Yeah. It doesn't matter. Right. And that's partly because that's not part of the enzyme profile that's damaged by kilning. Right. And I've had a malt scientist tell me, look, he says, Joe, you could take and you could add exogenous alpha amylase to a malt sample where you're going to run analysis, and it won't change the DP of that malt sample, because there's such an abundance in the enzyme balance in there that having more of it won't make any difference. So there's more than enough for our process. Yeah. So again, keep dialing back to focusing what's really important. To me, we really have to focus on the modification factors, the transition from barley to malt, and for protein and for carbohydrate modification. As brewers, we do want to know what the extract is, and we do want to know what the DP is. Possibly we want to know about the sizing assortment, so we might want to make mill adjustments, but I don't think there's anybody that looks at a malt analysis and then preemptively adjusts their mill. I just don't think it works that way. Yeah. Great. Well, to kind of wrap up to wrap up kind of your points here, I think the real takeaways for me are get rid of some of these parameters that like you said, the maltster doesn't even really have specific control over, and then focus on these ones that are really important, getting away from some of these analyses that are very old and obsolete. Yeah. And then also getting rid of other analyses that are that are not relevant to all malt brewers as well. So that's great. I think you did a great job of really kind of. Let me just hit one more of my favorite analysis that shouldn't be on, as part of wrap up. So your least favorite analysis is what my least favorite analysis right. is growth counts. Okay. Because growth counts are really, really important in the management of the process when there's green malt and you can see and get the acrospire. But when you kiln and dry the malt and then clean it, it means nothing. And it's impossible to do. What you're getting on a malt analysis, typically when you see a growth count, is the maltster is transferring over some of the growth counts that he made at the very end of the process, and he associates with this batch of malt coming through. But it's not done on finished malts. So I just focus on what's the critical indicators of a successful barley to malt transition. Okay, just separate the modification factors from the outcomes that a maltster gets from modification, and can't control. Like you say, they don't specifically control soluble protein, or they don't specifically control FAN. They control S over T, and they control beta glucan. And move away from the ones that I mentioned that are redundant and kind of obsolete now, fine coarse and viscosity, and then put aside the ones that aren't material at all to all malt brewing, the FAN and the alpha amylase. And again, you can look at this two ways. You can ask for a simplified malt analysis with just the key numbers on it, or you can train yourself. There's a couple things that you can do. You can just ask for a simplified analysis. You can at least ask the maltster to group the analysis into bundles, in all the protein things together, all the carbohydrate things together. Or you just condition yourself to your eye goes to the most important numbers. And I think it can be simpler than it looks. I think we have fallen into the trap of reporting on COAs everything that we can do.
Yeah, give me more numbers. Yeah.
I think
I'm not going to do anything with.
Yeah, we put them on there of what we can do, and it's good to have this kind of discussion and go back to just really what's important and what is an indicator of a quality malting process.
That's great. Well, thanks a lot, Joe.
Okay.
You want to give listeners a preview? I know you've agreed to come back and talk to us about some more things. You want to give a preview about what's on deck next?
Yes, I want to talk about color and flavor and kilning, because one of the things that's obvious to all of us as brewers is there's not a numerical specification, or there's not a way to define in a traditional malt specification flavor. And what we need to talk about in flavor is definitions of kilning techniques and approaches to create flavor. Because if we leave flavor out of the discussion and only work with numerical results, the only numerical results we have are color, moisture, and don't kill the enzymes. Well, we can do better than that by talking about flavor and the methodology of developing flavor in malt. And that's what I'm looking forward to talking to you about the next opportunity.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Joe. Really appreciate your time.
Okay. Thanks, John.
I learn more each time I hear Joe speak. Would you like to spend all day with Joe in a classroom? Enroll in the always sold-out 2-week MBAA Brewing and Malting Science course. This year, 6 brewers attended free of charge on Master Brewers scholarships. Click the Education tab at mbaa.com to learn more. Did you know that Master Brewers now has a mobile app? TQ articles, podcasts, webinars, Ask the Brewmasters, and more, all in the same place. Search Master Brewers in the App Store to download it now.
Just like that one day, like everyone else did. Calm down, I'm moving too fast.